Sharpe isn't just a classic piece of 90s British television. It's a show built on chaotic production stories, unexpected acting choices, historical quirks, and behind-the-scenes moments that shaped everything we see on screen. And for a series set during the Napoleonic Wars, the real drama often happened off the battlefield. So today, I'll be looking at 10 fun pieces of trivia that peel back the curtain on the making of Sharpe. Some of these you might recognise, but a few are the kind of tales that only the most devoted fans ever hear. This is perhaps the most well known, but did you know that Sean Bean wasn't the first person to actually play Sharpe? Now, it's impossible to imagine anyone but Sean Bean as Sharpe, but he wasn't the original man in the role. The part first belonged to Paul McGann, who keen movie lovers will know from his role as Lieutenant Bush in Hornblower, and also the 8th Doctor Who. McGann spoke about his stint as Sharpe to Soccer AM in 2012, saying he was still gutted not to be able to play the part, which was eventually taken on by Sean Bean. He said that he was Sharpe. He was the man for about 2 months. They went out to the Ukraine to shoot the first series for a little bit of R&R and to get everyone together on the Sunday before the Monday, which was the first day's shooting. And whilst playing footy on the beach, he had a rather nasty tackle. He went for a diagnosis and they said it was a sprain, but it was a Ukrainian sprain. They're tougher out there, he said. So he soldiered on for about 6 weeks, but this sprain never cleared up, so they had to get rid of him, and Sean got the job. Now, when Sean Bean was cast, the majority of the season had to be reshot. A planned 3rd episode based on Sharpe Gold had to be dropped as the delays cost them too much time, which was why the actual Sharpe's Gold that we got is so different. It was a tricky situation to be in. For starters, Sean Bean didn't look anything like Bernard Cornwell's description of Sharpe from the original novels. In the novels, he's described as over 6 feet tall, dark-haired and a Londoner, which in fact was more close to what Paul McGann looked like, apart from the height, as he was a little bit smaller. However, Sean Bean owned the role so thoroughly that Bernard Cornwell retconned the character as having spent a large part of his teenage years in Yorkshire to explain his accent. Another thing is, if you look at the jacket which Sean Bean wears on the cover picture for Sharpe's Rifles, it was actually tailored for Paul McGann, which is why the jacket hangs out from the front. He couldn't close it without it essentially becoming a girdle. One thing I do wish would be released are some clips of Paul McGann as Sharpe, if nothing else but to see his interpretation of this beloved character. Sergeant Patrick Harper is one of the toughest men in Sharpe, and in real life. During the filming of Sharpe's mission, we get a scene where Sergeant Pope attempts to assault Ramona. Harper, always watching, jumps in to save her. The scene ends with Sergeant Pope kicking Harper in the face to end their first fight. However, when Andrew Schofield went to do this, his planted foot slipped on the wet ground, and he accidentally kicked Daragh O'Malley for real, fracturing his cheek. According to Jason Sulkay's production diaries, the cast initially thought O'Malley had merely been bruised, but the swelling increased rapidly, and X-rays revealed a break that required surgical intervention. O'Malley spent the next couple of weeks recovering. The swelling you see on screen isn't all makeup, it was his actual swelling. O'Malley has joked in later interviews that he nearly lost half his face in Turkey when he suffered a terrible injury in that fight scene. And when we see Harper on later episodes, we see a small but visible scar on his cheek. This obviously wasn't part of the planned character look, and the makeup department kept reproducing it in subsequent episodes for continuity, turning an accidental injury into part of Harper's battlefield-hardened appearance. When you think of Major Hogan, he feels like the perfect recurring character. He's charming, witty, clever, and a brilliant foil for Sean Bean. And originally, that's exactly what the producers wanted. Hogan was planned to appear throughout the early series, guiding Sharpe the way he does in Bernard Cornwell's novels. In fact, Major Hogan appears in 10 of the novels, from Rifles all the way to Siege. But the reality behind the scenes of filming was a very different story, and it ended Hogan's screen life almost as soon as it began. In his autobiography, Putting a Rabbit in the Hat, he wrote about his experience. For a start, you had a bunch of filmmakers from the UK, way out of their comfort zone in the former Soviet Union, working with Russian co-producers who cut corners by underpaying the local crew. On top of that, you had a horrible rundown location far too close to the fallout of Chernobyl for comfort. Then you had abysmal facilities, nothing like the standard we were used to at home. You had terrible, terrible food, you had a director who was either drunk or hungover the whole time, and, worst of all, you had everybody struck down with illness. Cox was also appalled by the way some of the local crew treated the animals on set. At one point, he witnessed a crew member strike a horse directly in front of him, and completely lost his temper. A furious argument followed, one that Cox later said almost escalated into a physical fight. What shocked him even more was the response he received. The man insisted that he simply didn't understand how horses needed to be handled, and that his kind of behaviour was normal and necessary to make them obey. It was a stark example of the cultural clash behind the production. Two very different approaches to filmmaking, working conditions and animal treatment colliding head-on with no compromise in sight. And though the producers wanted Cox back for following seasons to continue the story faithfully, he had suffered enough. What he said was, "I didn't literally tell them to fuck off, in the same way that the shoot hadn't literally been a shitfest, or that shit hadn't literally hit the fan. I certainly did so, metaphorically. I actually liked the part, but I just wasn't prepared to put up with the conditions." So instead of hiring a new Hogan, the writers made a big creative pivot. They introduced a new engineer exploring officer for each series. This is where we get Nairn, Munro, and Ross. Each one essentially filled the Hogan role, the clever staff officer who supplies Sharpe with intelligence missions and occasional sarcasm. And it wasn't just Brian Cox, we also had David Troughton, who played Sir Arthur Wellesley in Sharpe's Rifles to Eagle, who also fell ill in the same conditions and decided not to return after Eagle, proving that Cox wasn't alone in the struggles. And in the end, Hogan became one of Sharpe's most memorable two-episode characters. Not by design, but because the production environment was every bit as dangerous as the Napoleonic battlefield it was trying to recreate. Hugh Fraser was the second Wellington in the show after he replaced David Troughton. The role also shouldn't have been as taxing as some of the roles which required lots of fighting. However, the biggest battle he faced wasn't Napoleon, it was his own prosthetic nose. Now, Wellington was rather famous for his long nose, good old Nosey. A nickname didn't come from nowhere. Now, because Hugh Fraser's nose was a little bit more normal, the makeup department had to create something special for Fraser to wear in every scene. Now, in a cool, controlled comfort of a British studio, it would work perfectly. However, out in a 40+ degree heat in Ukraine, it was a disaster waiting to melt. The problem was simple: sweat. As soon as they started filming under the blistering sun, heat built up between the prosthetic and Fraser's real nose. The glue couldn't cope, and by midday the false nose would start slipping, peeling or threatening to fall off entirely. The makeup team tried different adhesives, powders and sealants, but it was a challenge. And to make matters worse, the noses kept going missing. Fraser later recalled a full-blown panic when an entire batch vanished from the makeup trailer, sparking an overnight search through everyone's tents and costume crates. They did, however, eventually turn up, most likely having been taken to a party as a joke. But this didn't stop the team from keeping the prosthetics now under no security for the rest of the shoot. Despite all the chaos, Fraser soldiered through every scene with good humour, even as he sweated half the adhesive off. And in the end, the faint nose became one of the quiet but essential details that helped sell him completely as Wellington. A small prop, but an unexpectedly heroic one. Sean Bean's version of Richard Sharpe is rough, physical, and constantly throwing himself into danger, and that wasn't just the acting. Unlike most leading men, especially in this modern day of film and TV, Bean refused to use stunt double throughout the entire series. If Sharpe was climbing, fighting, falling, charging, or getting knocked flat, Bean insisted on doing it himself. But because of this, he did, however, have a very close call during the filming of Sharpe's regiment. In the scene where he is running from Simmerson, Bean was meant to fall during a chaotic cavalry charge. He went down exactly as planned, but what wasn't planned was the horse behind him slipping on the churned up ground and stepping directly onto him. For a few moments, the crew genuinely believed they just watched their lead actor get crushed. Bean, however, climbed to his feet, shaken but still in one piece. Instead of cutting that moment, director Tom Clegg actually kept it in the episode. Bean has actually spoken on this incident, saying, "I've never really hurt myself badly. I suppose the closest I've ever come to an accident is in Sharpe's regiment, when a horse landed on my head. They actually used that take. The bank collapsed and the horse hoof sort of sprung off my head as he was jumping. I got a bit of a black eye and a bit of a neck problem. And about 6 hours before I went hospital getting my finger stitched up because I just cut that open. And then by the afternoon, the horse landed on my head. That were close, because I watched it back and it were a bit iffy." And that wasn't the only scare for Sharpe during the course of the series. He has been thrown off horses, bruised and strained muscles from sword fights, tore costume seams mid-battle, and walked away from several takes with cuts and scrapes that ended up on camera. Yet he never changed his stance. If Sharpe did it, Bean did it. However, all this came at a cost, and although he survived many times in Sharpe, he finally ran out of lives for the rest of his cinematic roles. Of all the chosen men in Sharpe, Harris often stands out. He is more calm, articulate, reflective, and slightly out of place among the rougher and rowdier characters, shall we say. And there's a reason why he feels different, because unlike most of Sharpe's men, Harris didn't exist in the original novels. While creating the TV adaptation, the producers wanted someone who could deliver thoughtful lines, explain military ideas, and add a touch of wit and intelligence without Sharpe having to say everything himself. So they created a new character, inspired by a real historical figure, Rifleman Benjamin Harris, a veteran of the 95th Rifles whose battlefield memoirs were dictated after the war. And actor Jason Solke brought a completely new flavour to the show, well-spoken, bookish, and often the most sensible voice in the group. His performance was so memorable that Bernard Cornwell took notice. Harris quickly became a fan favourite, and Cornwell enjoyed the dynamic he brought to the team. So much so that he retroactively added Harris to later novels, giving the character an official place in Sharpe's literary canon, with his first appearance in book order being Sharpe's Battle. There is also quite a fun recurring detail. In the TV series, Harris's first name is never revealed. In Sharpe's Waterloo, Hagman even asks him directly, and Harris dodges the question entirely. This ambiguity created a long-running debate about whether he was meant to be Benjamin Harris or just simply a homage. Even after Sharpe wrapped filming, Jason Solke is ever present in the Sharpe world by creating an entire website, riflemanharris.co.uk. It is an extensive library of Sharpe content. Information about him, his fellow cast members, there are videos, images, small nuggets of information that really make you love the show even more. Also, I would highly recommend his book Romeo with Love. It was a fascinating read, with more in-depth stories on how the show really came together. From a last-minute TV intervention to a canonised member of Sharpe's world, Harris is one of the best examples of a series and the novels influencing each other. Now, I think we all know Sharpe was known to be quite the ladies' man in the show, but it wasn't just in the show that Sean Bean found love. He met his future wife, Abigail Crutterton, whilst filming Sharpe. She played Jane Gibbons, Sharpe's second wife on screen, and the chemistry didn't stop when the cameras did. They married in 1997, though much like Sharpe's Luck and Love, the marriage didn't last. They divorced in 2000, but their daughter remains a positive link between them. But it wasn't just Sean Bean that met love on Sharpe. Scott Cleverdon, who played Harry Price, met Assumpta Serna, who, as we know, plays Teresa Marino. Their connection was immediate, and unlike their fictional counterparts, their story had a much more happier ending. They married and remain together to this day, living in Madrid. Certainly one of the series' real-life success stories. Even good old Jason Solke met his future wife on the production. Natasha worked as a translator for the Ukrainian crew during the earliest series shoots. And amidst all the chaos of the production, the language barriers, and the health scares of filming in Crimea, the two developed a quiet but lasting relationship. They eventually married and now have a son, Daniel. All of this goes to show that despite the grueling conditions, Sharpe managed to create genuine bonds amongst its cast and crew. Some were brief, some became lifelong marriages, but all of them began in the same way, on a tough, unpredictable film set where camaraderie mattered just as much off the screen as on it. Whilst watching Sharpe, you may notice a certain rifleman with a group that seldom spoke. He first appeared in Sharpe's company and participated in the Forlorn Hope. In Sharpe's honour, he survived the Battle of Vittoria and managed to take the cannons. He appeared in Sharpe's battle, helping Lord Kiley and the Irish company train. In Sharpe's sword, he participated in the Battle of the French Fortress, as well as appearing in Sharpe's regiment, siege, and in mission. So, who is he? Now you may think he is just some extra, used to fill the ranks, yet he was so much more than that. He was in fact the show's historical and technical advisor, and is a respected Napoleonic military historian, reenactor, weapons expert, and consultant on period military life. He is best known in historical circles as an expert on British Army of the late 18th and early 19th centuries. He is particularly respected on his work for understanding the correct Napoleonic uniforms, his expertise on drill and battlefield practices, his consulting for museums and reenactment groups, and his historical writing on British light infantry and riflemen. This made him perfect for Sharpe, which, especially in the early series, relied heavily on reenactors and historians for bringing authenticity to battlefield scenes. His experience behind the camera was invaluable. He offered guidance on how soldiers carried themselves, how uniforms should be worn, how officers issued commands, how drill, marching and musket handling should look, and period-correct behaviour in camp and on the battlefield. Jason Solke mentions him several times in the Rifleman Diaries, praising him as someone the actors learned a great deal from when preparing to portray riflemen authentically. The music of Sharpe caused quite a stir when the series first aired, especially among historical purists. Each episode opened with a bold title theme that mixed traditional scoring with electric guitars, an audacious choice for a drama set during the Napoleonic and Peninsular Wars. But it worked. The moment those first chords hit, you knew exactly what you were watching. The soundtrack, crafted mostly by John Tams and Dominic Muldowney, struck the perfect balance. Modern enough to give the show energy, but grounded in the spirit of the period. And it needed to be, as music was central to the lives of real soldiers of the era. In camp, on the march, or in crowded taverns, some songs were centuries old. Others were written by fashionable coffeehouse composers who sold sheet music for pennies. You had regimental bands, especially the pipe and drums, provide the heartbeat of the British Army, driving men forward with lively quick marches and carrying them home with slow, solemn strains. Among those traditions, none was more enduring than the marching song associated with the 95th Rifles, Over the Hills and Far Away. However, this tune isn't a new creation, it predates the regiment by a century, and had become so widespread that it was even popular in colonial America. It's a genuine 18th century marching ballad, passed from regiment to regiment and rewritten endlessly. It was sometimes noble, sometimes humorous, occasionally downright filthy, depending on the company you keep. And when the producers sought the musical identity of the series, they turned to John Tams, already a respected folk musician, as well as the actor behind Hagman. He revived the old marching tune and shaped it for the world of Sharpe. And fun fact, if you listen closely enough to the lyrics ending each episode, you'll notice that they are all slightly different. For example, for Sharpe's Eagle and Sharpe's Mission, the lyrics go,
"Here's 40 shillings on the drum to those who volunteer to come to list and fight the foe today, over the hills and far away."
Or from Sharpe's Company, they go,
"Through smoke and fire and shot and shell, into the very walls of hell, but we shall stand and we shall stay, over the hills and far away."
His rendition became one of the most cherished elements of Sharpe, a perfect final note after every episode. One of the most fascinating pieces of Sharpe trivia is that the series owes much of its distinctive look and many of its chaotic production stories to the collapse of the Soviet Union. Because when filming began in the early 1990s, Ukraine and Crimea were still full of Soviet-era military bases, abandoned training grounds, and thousands of recently demobilised soldiers looking for work. Filming often took place in old Soviet training lands, vast open areas scarred by trenches, vehicle tracks, shell pits, and derelict concrete structures. And what the production team presented as the hills of Spain or Portugal were, in reality, ex-military landscapes that had only just been vacated. It gave the show a raw, unforgiving atmosphere that not many other locations could have replicated. The battles, too, were a product of the post-Soviet world. Instead of hiring film extras, the producers brought in entire groups of former Soviet soldiers. These men knew how to drill, march, ride horses, and handle weapons with absolute precision. They moved with the discipline of trained troops because, until months earlier, that's exactly what they were. Money was also tight, and the production used whatever it could get its hands on. Old Soviet boots, blankets, belts, and military coats were re-dyed and adapted into Napoleonic uniforms. Even the vehicles left behind, from trucks to personnel carriers, became the transport fleet for cast and crew. Some were held together with wire and hope, but without them, the production simply couldn't have moved across the countryside. Even the Spanish villages weren't always what they seemed. Several rural buildings and courtyard sets were really Soviet-era farm blocks or abandoned communal housing, hastily disguised with shutters, painted plaster, and wagon wheels. The artillery was no exception. Many of the cannons on screen began life as Soviet film props or scrap metal from military stores. The prop makers bolted wooden barrels over steel frames, repainted them, and transformed them into convincing Napoleonic field guns. A few had even appeared in Soviet historical epics decades earlier, such as the film Peter the Great. And holding the production together behind the scenes were Soviet-trained specialists, horse wranglers or abusers, as Brian Cox would potentially call them, who had armourers, pyrotechnicians, carpenters and mechanics. Many had years' experience working for state film studios like Mosfilm, meaning they brought a level of practical expertise that Sharpe's small British crew depended on. And in the end, the legacy of the Soviet Union gave Sharpe its authenticity, and even its chaos. Without the abandoned military lands, the cheap labour, the surplus equipment, and the technical skills left behind after the collapse of the USSR, Sharpe simply couldn't have looked the way it does. And that's what made it special. It's an unusual legacy, but a fitting one. Sharpe might be set in the Napoleonic Wars, but it was brought to life in the shadow of a much more modern one. And that's just a glimpse into the wild, chaotic and surprisingly fascinating world behind ITV Sharpe. From last-minute casting changes, real injuries, and musical traditions, the series was every bit as dramatic behind the camera as it was on screen. If you enjoyed this look into the world behind Sharpe, let me know in the comments which fact surprised you the most, or share another of your own favourite piece of trivia. And if you'd like to see more Sharpe content, rankings, reviews, character spotlights, or deep dives, make sure you're subscribed and click the notification bell so you don't miss what's coming next. Thank you again for your continued support, and I'll see you over the hills and far away.